Cool. Hi, everybody. I think we're live here. We're just going to wait a few more minutes for the room to fill out a little bit, and then we'll get going maybe in about 2 to 4 minutes.
All right, everyone. If people trickle in now, that's absolutely fine. I think the presentation will be recorded and we're happy to share the notes afterwards as well. So no worries. But thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Lucia Wagner. I lead our NGO team here at eBury in the UK office, along with my colleague Dylan. I'm sure some of you know, hopefully most of you know about eBury and what we do, but we're essentially a payments and treasury partner, and we work extensively with NGOs, both here in the UK and globally. We've got 40 offices in 29 countries now, so quite widespread. And we really specialize in payments to emerging markets specifically, particularly in the work we do is helping NGOs delivering funds to some of the hardest to reach regions of the world, that the trickiest jurisdictions. So we're pretty acutely aware of the banking bottlenecks that NGOs face in this space, particularly in regions that we're going to cover today. So we hope you find it useful. But the reason we decided to plan this session actually was because we hosted an event with the Charity Finance Group earlier in the year in February. It was a networking breakfast. And one of the topics of discussion for the morning was correspondent banking. How does it work? What are the challenges that NGOs are facing when navigating correspondent banking, and particularly in regions where there are sanctions implications? And we honestly were blown away at what a popular topic it was. That was probably the one that had the most questions throughout the morning and garnered the most interest. So we decided to expand on that, also because of what's been going on with the regime change in Syria, and of course the escalations on ongoing conflict in Palestine. So we thought it was timely, and hopefully you'll find it very useful. But I'll pass over to my colleague Dylan as well to do a bit of an intro on the speakers that we have and the session for the day.
Thanks, Lucia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I'll quickly just run through the structure of this webinar, and then afterwards we'll get into a bit of an introduction for our key speaker here. So we're expecting maybe looking at just shy of an hour. We're going to go through different sanctioned jurisdictions. We encourage you guys to ask questions, so please, after a slide, if you've got it, either raise your hand or you can see a little Q&A box there where you can pop your question in and we'll answer it. We've got some follow-up questions ourselves, Lucia and I, so we'll be interjecting here and there. And then after we've gone over the sanctions sections is the correspondent banking part, as well as some NGO tips and tricks. But look, without further ado, let me quickly introduce Hamza, who is eBury's global head of sanctions, and then we can get this show on the road. So what does global head of sanctions mean? Hamza is essentially our go-to person for making sure that eBury is staying afloat and just navigating the ever-changing international sanctions rules, which we'll learn about today. He's actually got a really strong background in financial compliance, honing his skills at Lloyd's, HSBC, as well as Citi. But I found out yesterday, kicking off his whole career as a lawyer. So Hamza definitely brings a unique depth of expertise here. So without further ado, Hamza, please come to the stage. And yeah, guys, just encourage questions. So if you've got them, please don't be shy.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for that lovely introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for all joining. I can see a few former colleagues and others in attendance. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Really nice to have you all here. Dylan's given you guys the structure of the presentation. I really hope this will be helpful and beneficial for NGOs and kind of the wider audience who are in attendance here. As both Dylan and Lucia mentioned, please do interject with questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible. I appreciate it's a webinar, so sometimes the tech can be a little bit fiddly, but please do send questions over the chat/Q&A function, and we can try and kind of answer as many of those as possible, or we can save them for the end, but feel free to jump in as and when people see fit. Cool, so I guess I'm gonna kick off straight away. I think it's maybe the best way to go, and then we can sort of chop and change from there, depending on how we get on with certain questions. As you probably guessed by the slide that's been on the board for a few minutes, the primary title of this will be Navigating Sanctions Compliance and Correspondent Banking, and how correspondent banking interacts with payments, specifically when we're talking payments to sanction jurisdictions or jurisdictions that are subject to some type of sanctions risk. Yeah, there's a quick slide on me and a lovely picture for everyone in case anyone wanted to see what I like with a moustache, which I had for a few weeks. Talking primarily about the first country. So as is the case for kind of sanctions and almost an illustration of kind of the ever-changing landscape, when I started preparing for this particular webinar a few weeks back, the situation in Syria was significantly different. As of, I'm going to say, approximately end of May 2025, the trend has been going on for a little bit of time before then. We have seen a move towards a word we kind of use in the compliance community called desanctioning, not really a word, but kind of a term that is reasonably self-explanatory, where we are seeing a move towards desanctioning of Syria. Now, this is particularly applicable and particularly relevant for NGOs. Almost all the NGOs I've worked with throughout my time at eBury, as well as my time with other institutions, have had an interest in making payments to Syria. For obvious reasons, due to the vast majority of conflicts and human rights requirements and aid requirements that are present within the country. Previously, there were a number of general licenses, and there were the possibility of specific licenses issued by OFAC or other similar sanctions regulators in order to facilitate payments. However, this has always historically been very tricky, even with the presence of those licenses. As of let's say about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, the US and OFAC, the primary sanctions regulatory body in the US, issued a general license 25. Effectively, general license 25, for all intents and purposes, lifts the majority of sanctions prohibitions that have previously been issued against Syria and the Syrian regime. So anything that was previously prohibited under OFAC's primary regulation previous regulation is now in theory not prohibited. Now, there are a few caveats to that, and I think the caveats are important to note. There are still a significant presence of SDNs, so designated individual, designated national, designated entities under the UK, the US, and the EU program. They still reside in Syria, and those are effectively still non-paying, and the vast majority of institutions are unlikely to want to facilitate transactions towards those. However, there is a significant reduction in the sanctions compliance concerns specifically related to Syria based on the issuance of this general license a few weeks ago. The EU and the UK quite quickly followed suit. There's a bit of tandem with the US approach there. And we have seen, again, a similar approach by both regulatory bodies, where there has been a slow lifting to the point where the sanctions regime against Syria now looks very, very different to what it looked like a couple of weeks ago. There are a few points I think it's worth noting here that I think will again continue to be very significant for NGOs. Is previously it's been a challenge, and I'm sure most people on this call who've been involved in payments will be aware, of facilitating any sort of SWIFT payments into Syria. The vast majority of banks, if not all the banks, have been closed off from the ability to receive SWIFT transactions, to receive funds from other banks. So the primary method of distributing funds into Syria had been through Turkey, through Lebanon, through neighboring countries where cash had been either taken over the border manually or through Hawala networks or similar type of payment, local payment institutions, which tend to present a higher risk. we have seen a lifting of a lot of the regulation around those particular banks. One of the primary bank, the real estate bank, which is one of the bigger banks in Syria, was up until fairly recently on the SDN list. That has now been removed. So in theory, there is now the opportunity for those corresponding banking channels between institutions who make payments to open up those channels with Syrian institutions. Now, there is still a significant amount of risk, both sanctions and more generic holistic financial crime risk present in Syria. So it may take some time for those banks to both develop the appetite commercially as well as risk appetite wise to facilitate more traditional kind of open correspondent banking. But the fact that that is now on the table is a huge change. It may not be something that is going to change the day to day as of now. But in my opinion, I'm hoping in the next 6-8 months, maybe even longer. I suspect that due diligence will take quite some time. But I'm hoping that eventually we would see an ability for institutions in this part of the world to be able to transact with banks in Syria to really ensure that some of the correspondent banking and some of the payment challenges and bottlenecks that have been in place up until now in respect to making sending funds to Syria will be closed. So yeah, we're hoping. I think there's a hope on the ground throughout both the NGO and kind of the more wider sanctions regulatory community and maybe the compliance community more generally, that we will see a move towards this. I think it's also really important to note that this doesn't mean that Syria suddenly becomes a low-risk country without any requirements for additional due diligence, regardless of the comprehensive sanction status of the country. We do know that there is still a significant degree of risk in Syria that is both sanctions, and again, as I mentioned before, more holistic financial crime related risk. So it's important that both NGOs and any institution looking to make a payment that may have a Syrian nexus in some capacity, that they're very cognizant of that fact, and the appropriate due diligence is conducted and will continue to be conducted. But again, we're hoping to see a slight ease off and hoping that will facilitate a much easier journey for NGOs who have a nexus or have activity in Syria. I will pause there, just because I know I've been babbling, so I'll pause there for any particular questions in relation to Syria. And hopefully we can work it that way, and then we can go through each jurisdiction, maybe ask a few questions, and then go on to other parts of the presentation. So I'll leave it 30 seconds so we'll gather their thoughts. So yeah, any questions on Syria?
I'll kick one off, Hamza, because I think you mentioned an interesting point there regarding cash delivery as well as Hawala networks. It's something that we come across, quite a bit when we're talking with clients. From your perspective, what are the key compliance considerations or due diligence measures that you think NGOs should be prioritizing when they do engage with local partners or Hawala networks?
Thanks. It's a great question. And yeah, whilst I think the situation in Syria in terms of, sort of more traditional bank transfers, I'm hoping will change. I think it will take some time before that happens. So in more direct response to your question, my personal advice and where I would say NGOs I work with have the most success is where those type of facilities, whether it's cash or Hawala networks or whatever it is, are appropriately documented through accurate compliance procedures. So what I kind of mean more specifically by that is the ability for the NGO to demonstrate to EBRI or whoever their relevant payment institution is exactly how that journey works. So who does the money go to, whether that's Turkey, whether that's Lebanon, and how does that ultimately make its way to Syria? And what are the checks and balances in place to ensure that those funds are not distributed to terrorist organizations, to any other organization which may present a financial crime or sanctions risk? So what kind of policies, procedures, have those policies and procedures been vetted? Have those policies and procedures been audited? Has there been any type of external training? Has there been any type of external review, either through an audit or some type of similar external review that has validated those policies to ensure that they meet the required level of due diligence banks and FIs and other payment institutions are likely to need? And just to sort of touch on what I mentioned before, can the NGOs and the relevant people within the NGO organizations who wish to make these transactions, are they in a position to be able to explain that in a way that a compliance or sanctions professional within an institution is able to understand that? I think that's, for me, that's a huge consideration. And it's a part where I think that it can make sort of personally my or other compliance officers' jobs easier, but more importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, it is a mechanism to ensure that the payments flow as smooth as possible. Right? We'll talk about correspondent banking a bit more later, But with any payment channel to any high-risk jurisdiction, especially when cash is involved, and cash obviously presents a risk for sort of both, more holistic financial crime reasons, its ability for NGOs and other institutions to recognize that it presents a risk and have adequate mitigants in place through policies, procedures, and relevant checks and balances along the way.
Thanks so much. Did anyone have any questions either in the chat or the Q&A function? Oh, I think there is one in the Q&A function. Hamza, can you read the?
I can't see it. But can you read it to me? Is that okay?
Yeah. So let me copy and paste it into the chatter as well. So everyone else, I'm not entirely familiar with myself. So just if anyone else wants to see it, there you are. It said, hi, Hamza. While sanctions being lifted is great for Syria, for correspondent banks, for example, large US banks, how challenging do you think the EDD will be given the environment in Syria in the past decade plus? Do you think it is realistic a Syrian bank would pass a US bank EDD given lack of scrutiny in recent years from said banks?
It's a great question. I think there's probably sort of two separate answers. I think the answer I'd like to say is, if kind of putting my kind of personal out would be yes. Having worked in correspondent banking due diligence at previous organizations, I think it's a very fair point that this individual is making, that we're probably quite some way away from that, right? Just because legislatively, technically, that's now permissible where it wasn't a few weeks ago. I think it would have to be a very, very brave US institution, whether it's one of the major banks or maybe a smaller provider, to kind of open those corridors, because the likelihood is when you had a bank like Real Estate Bank in Syria or any of the comparable banks who have been subject to sanctions for, quite some years now, even basic things like annual accounts, like KYC, this kind of stuff is not going to be anywhere near the level most institutions would need it to be. So I think the realistic answer is unfortunately no. I would like to think that, there will be someone who's brave at some point. Maybe someone we work with, that'd be great for us. But, again, I appreciate that. Like when, the risk owners of that particular type of risk, that's going to be very complex to them through. I don't know if I'd be brave enough to go to senior members within an organization and say, hey, I want to open up banking channels with Syria, because the due diligence requirements are going to be pretty extreme. But I'd hope that, throughout the course of more likely years, but maybe months if we're being optimistic, there's the possibility that there's allowances or there's some degree of mutual understanding that we're likely to see a different risk appetite. But no, it's going to be very difficult. And I think, again, to the point I made earlier, it'll be a very brave institution to be the first one to even just kick off that conversation, let alone actually commence that EDD.
There was a second question in the Q&A as well, Hamza. I'm just going to post it in the chat. It was, will you still need a license if you're purchasing fuel?
So I think I'd probably stay away from giving very specific points. I think the best thing I'd do is, let's say, we could bring the general license up later and probably discuss that. But what I would say is the vast majority of stuff that was previously restricted doesn't exist anymore. A lot of the previous sanctions that were attributed to that are no longer required. So previously, where you would have required a license, you may not. I think you'd need the specifics of the transaction, the fuel, all those type of things to make a definitive assessment on that. But the general point I would make, without being too specific, is hopefully likely not. But yeah, again, depends who it's from, depends on the fuel source. There's sort of multiple other risk considerations rather than just the pure Syria part. But the idea would be that those type of activity would be easy to facilitate, generally speaking.
There was another question as well. I'll just post it. Sorry, 2 seconds. It was, hi, Hamza, given GL25 can be rescinded at any time and export controls have not yet been rescinded, based on what you're hearing, do you realistically see US banks engaging with Syria in the near future?
Yeah, I think this is a very similar response to the question. I think that, I think speaking kind of quite bluntly, like, with the recent regime change in Syria, and I use the term, relatively recent compared to the previous one, despite it being there for a couple of months now, I think that there's the distinct possibility, and we've seen, both through the US and other regulatory bodies have, reissued and, issued sanctions. Anyone who was around for the Iran JCPOA thing back in the day, not quite a comparable situation, but I think that, sort of that toing and froing in respect to sort of sanctions compliance and requirements is maybe potentially, kind of comparable. So I think export controls will continue to be a thing. I think that there is still what you'd call quote unquote bad actors present in Syria, where the presence of export or the requirement for export controls, both in the US and the remaining kind of major sanctions regulators, is likely to remain. I mean, I think some of those lists may be trimmed, but the Syria lists aren't very long. It's not like the Russia lists, which have multiple items. The Syria lists are very specific to certain type of items, military arms embargoes. So yeah, I think similar to I think it'd be a very brave bank who would actually kind of physically open up those correspondent banking channels or enter into any type of relationship with Syrian banks. I still think that's going to be tricky. I still think we're likely to see, from a kind of typology perspective, sort of aid transactions to Syria being done through Huawei networks, through cash, through those type of things we mentioned earlier. I suspect for the next, well, for the foreseeable future, that will be the way that the activity tends to play out. I mean, you never know. I mean, I guess maybe I'm an optimist. I'd like to say that maybe someone will, but I could completely understand and probably even, if I'm honest, support a decision to take quite a cautious approach with this type of stuff, given the general political instability in the region that could quite easily result in either regime changes or reissuance of more comprehensive sanctions, both in the short and long term.
Nice. We had another question come in there, Hamza. It's a short one, but I believe that the UK's ISIL sanctions are still relevant to HTS. That's a question.
Yeah. So again, that's a very good question. And we're likely to, I think direct transactions or facilities transactions with HTS specifically are potentially going to be outside of most institutions' risk appetite. I'm talking quite generally without speaking for an institution. So yeah, I think that those type of risks and those type of designations, both listed persons under the OFSI UK designation and the wider SDNs under US and listed persons under EU, are still going to be present within Syria, right? It's not just because some of the sanctions have been lifted. This is not going to be a full, complete rollback. There are still significant kind of sanctions-related concerns in Syria, and it would be important for any sort of bank or institution who was supporting payments to Syria through other networks to be conscious of elements like that. So more kind of list-based sanctions as opposed to kind of country sanctions is likely to kind of remain a risk in Syria for some time, I think.
Cool. Is it worthwhile just mentioning what their harmonized tariff schedule is, the HTS or the ISIL?
I mean, those. I think this is more in relation to, rather than the tax. This is more in relation to the organizations who form the government in Syria. I suspect that's what that is referring to, as well as other institutions who that have formed senior government and similar type of organizations within the Syrian or the new Syrian regime, I should say. So those sanctions continue to be relevant. I think there's no way around that. Whether the UK pulls those back in the near future, I think, is an interesting point to kind of be cognizant of. It's something that I will certainly be keeping an eye on. Whether they directly impact aid, I guess, depends on the aid channel. So that's probably worth being aware of. But again, it sort of points to that wider fact we're speaking about, that there's likely to continue to be a significant sanctions risk in Syria, even though the quote unquote comprehensive program may no longer exist at this current time. Good stuff. Cool. And if there's no more questions, I'm just slightly in the interest of time, I might shift on to the next one. But if anyone does have any other Syria questions or thoughts, then please drop in the chat. We can try and get to them sort of towards the end of the presentation, if I can scoot through a few other things. So thanks. That was really great engagement from everyone. There we go. Palestine is another one which I think is like another jurisdiction which I think is likely to continue to be relevant throughout the NGO kind of community. I think there's a few important points to make around. It doesn't have the same type, or never had the same, I should say, rather comprehensive type of program that a Syria or potentially in Iran, a slightly different comparable situation, has had. There continue to be targeted sanctions issued by UK, US, and EU authorities towards Palestine. I think historically, and people on this call may argue with me slightly, but I think historically getting funds into Palestine or neighboring territories has been slightly less problematic than in Syria as a comparison point, because you don't quite have the same number of comprehensive level type of sanctions. However, there still continues to be challenges around risk appetite. We know within Palestine and the neighboring territories that there continues to be a significant presence of SDNs, of listed individuals, of terrorist organizations, of multiple type of actors who continue to significantly raised the general risk profile of the country. So we continue to see that landscape continue to evolve and shift. I think one of the more major takeaways here, and I'd be interested to know kind of those who may be slightly closer to this type of activity on the ground, is there is the potential we're seeing a sort of a divergence between the UK and EU approach and the US approach, and whether the groups they are sanctioning, whether that be the settler groups or the terrorist groups that are present within the jurisdictions, how they continue to sort of diverge through different pathways there. I think that is going to be a very interesting development to keep an eye on. And I think that's going to continue to be overly relevant to Palestine. So the jurisdiction in which the NGOs or any entity is based, and as well as the payment channels and the correspondent banking mechanisms, is like to have a fairly significant influence over appetite with respect to banks and transactions. I will, just in the interest of time, I'll stop there and kind of push to any questions in respect to Palestine. I know there's maybe quite a lot going on there, so happy to spend a few minutes on this if anyone feels the need to ask some specific questions.
I've got one just off of the point you raised, Hamza, but please feel free, everyone, to jump in as well and put your questions in the chat. But you mentioned, the divergence that we may be seeing between the UK and the US and the EU in terms of their approach to compliance and sanctions, broadly speaking, in relation to Palestine, but also sort of considering the significant cuts that we've seen in US aid this year. Do you anticipate a shift away, or this kind of de-dollarization narrative that we've heard from the start of the year? Do you anticipate that shift occurring in terms of funding in the region away from the dollar?
I think so, and I know we've kind of individually as well as collectively throughout, maybe more in regards to tariffs, but it's applicable to sanctions, spoken about de-dollarization and kind of how that impacts. And again, the primary kind of conversation has been generally in respect to tariffs, but I think it's potentially applicable to sanctions here as well. And again, it's an ever-evolving situation, so it's the one to keep an eye on. But at a very basic level, if you assume, and again, being very basic on purpose here, that the UK doesn't have a problem with a certain actor, but the US does, you're much more likely to see a GBP transaction likely to be funded. Now, it's also worth noting more generally that banks tend to have global risk appetites. So institutions, and Avery does the same, will take into account US, EU, and UK sanctions, as well as relevant local sanctions authorities as well. So there's significant risk appetite considerations that banks and other payment institutions need to abide by. So even if a transaction is permissible, there tends to still be other things to consider. But I do think that, again, from a personal point of view, it's worth reviewing that type of activity. I think historically the transaction or the currency for a lot of things, but especially for aid, has always been dollars for obvious reasons. I would not be surprised if we start to see, for a number of reasons, a shift maybe away from that. Again, I don't expect it to be overnight. I don't think we'll suddenly move everything to euros or GBP, but I would not be surprised to see a small shift. And I think we've seen, from an EBRI level, without going into too many details, we've seen some of those typologies start to play out. Again, it's still very early doors and there's still a lot to kind of go through. So it's not quite kind of as established, but I think you can see some green shoots of that type of thing happening, or at least NGOs and other kind of finance entities considering that type of activity.
Nice. I'll jump in. It's a bit of a broader question from myself, but you'd mentioned that historically and currently that sanctions around Palestine has very heavily been on individuals, groups, or companies rather than the territory itself. So with that, what would your expectations be around the future trajectory of not just Palestine, but Israel, especially given all of the increasing uncertain geopolitical situation going on?
It's a great question, and I think it's very tricky to come to a conclusion with that. I think that my personal opinion would be we'd like to see an extension of what we see now, but then again, that's very much dictated by certain political actors on multiple sides of the equator, and kind of how they decide to behave in respect to that. Any type of comprehensive sanctions program would be unprecedented, and I suspect uncalled for, and maybe not necessarily required. It wouldn't have the targeted impact, but these things aren't impossible. If you listen to the rhetoric of some UK politicians, or even politicians outside the UK, this rhetoric does seem to kind of potentially be within their landscape or within their sort of zone of things they're considering. So I definitely don't think it's off the table. It would be huge, and it would be moving away from the political side of it, it would be very unprecedented for something like that to happen, and not something which I think many people would be in favor of. But we do live in kind of uncertain political times, and sanctions tends to follow politics, right? I think that the usage of sanctions as a foreign policy tool, is well established, and I don't think that particular typology, whether it's in regards to Palestine or anywhere else, is likely to change. So depending on how the situation evolves, it wouldn't be, I wouldn't fall off my chair type thing. But yeah, I would say I hope not, but it's definitely within the realms of the possible would be my kind of general kind of cop-out answer, if you like, to that.
No, thank you. I think we've got one more question there. Perhaps we can come back around to this one when we're on the correspondent banking. Okay, I can flag it and come back.
Absolutely, cool. Okay, I'll move on and just let me know when it's ready to bring that particular question back up again. There we go. Sorry, I thought I skipped the slide there. Now moving on to maybe a slightly, say, less controversial, but I guess all these have degrees of controversy and requirements to them. But Afghanistan continues to operate as another jurisdiction in which NGOs have had a need and a requirement to facilitate aid transactions to. Afghanistan tends to, despite having sanctions programs across the various regulatory programs, there still is a significant variety of sanctions present in Afghanistan, but these tend to be list-based. There are asset freezes, travel bans, arms embargoes, as I mentioned, being present there as well. And there are government entities and entities that are linked to the government, which tend to have a similar sanction status. But from a kind of purely risk parameterization point of view, it maybe doesn't quite hit the same heights, as Syria. I guess depends on which risk profile we're talking about here, but we do see a reasonable divergence between those two. Afghanistan again continues to be a jurisdiction which needs aid and needs NGO support. As such, we have seen an uptick in transactions there, both from an EBRI perspective and I think more broadly. Some of those kind of correspondent banking channels or those payment channels, again, easy to facilitate than Assyria. The licensing requirements, because of the nature of the sanctions programs, are not quite as tenuous. Again, it's very much dependent on the type of activity and kind of how, what type of aid we're facilitating, which counterparties we're facilitating aid to, all the types of sort of standard EDD or questions we would expect to ask Afghanistan. But we tend to see this one be a little bit less problematic than the other two jurisdictions we've just covered. And I think that what I would recommend, or one point I've made to NGOs who have had an Afghanistan nexus in the past, is again similar to what I mentioned with Syria, but fully understanding how those payment chains work and ensuring there are appropriate checks and balances within those payment channels or chains to ensure that both the aid is going where it needs to go, but more importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, so you can present to your bank, your FI, your payment service provider, exactly what type of due diligence you do over those counterparties to ensure that banks can, hopefully take comfort from that and assist you with those payments. I'll pause for 30 seconds on Afghanistan before I move on.
I've got one, Hamza.
Please.
So in the experience of EBRI's experience, what would you say some of the key considerations or challenges are when processing these transactions to Afghanistan, given its high-risk status? Some organizations can deliver Afghan AFN there, some can deliver euros, some can't. What's your experience through working with EBRI?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, if you're ranking countries in terms of easiest to hardest, some of the ones we've discussed and we can need to discuss, Afghanistan, I would say, is one of the easier side of the high risk ones. And again, I use the term easy quite loosely because it's definitely not easy, but easier is maybe the better terminology. In terms of kind of what I've seen, we do see an uptick in transactional activity, which again aligns with some of the humanitarian aid requirements there. We've worked very closely at EBRI level with our partner institutions who help us with these payments, so we can ensure that if we're processing these payments on behalf of clients, we've had a sort of very high success rate of them getting through, and I'm sure other institutions are at the same, given the risk profile of the country. The key considerations I think continue to kind of be a consistent theme is understanding how those payment channels work and ensuring that NGOs or anyone present with Afghanistan Nexus is aware of the nature of the risks and is aware of kind of where those intersections and risk points potentially flare up, and they're in a position to kind of hopefully support that with documentation, with policies, with the appropriate checks and balances, to ensure that they cover those particular risks. And the hope behind covering those risks is you give comfort to banking institutions that they are happy to support those payments. Well, that's the basic principle anyway.
Thank you.
Good stuff. I will jump on to the next jurisdiction. I think I did see the question in the chat, but again, to your point, that I might just save it for when we get closer to the correspondent. I think that might be slightly more relevant for that section. But thank you for that question, whoever that was. I won't spend a huge amount of time on Sudan and South Sudan. Again, I'm conscious that we do have the hour and everyone's time is very precious. But we continue to see this again, similar to in some ways what we mentioned with other jurisdictions. We continue to see an evolving situation up until fairly recently. I think there's a fairly verifiable news report from the BBC to some extent that we're likely to see new US sanctions issued against Sudan. Sorry, I'm struggling to talk this often. Issued against Sudan for the alleged use of chemical weapons. That kind of activity tends to be a precursor for sanctions. I suspect those will be arms embargoes rather than kind of comprehensive sanctions. I think that's very much the noise and the theme coming out of those particular incidents, which is unlikely to affect NGOs directly, given that probably result in dealing that relates to arms embargoes, or hopefully not. But obviously that's kind of another thing to be cognizant of. The wider risk profile of the country already being high risk, or the countries I should say already being high risk, is likely to increase. Even if that increase in risk doesn't directly affect the NGOs, it will affect the risk scoring of those particular countries, and that's likely to continue to to have an impact in terms of anyone who wants to get payments in and out, or most likely in, I should say, rather than out, to either South Sudan or Sudan, as well as the existing kind of asset freeze programs, the embargoes, and the various other bits and pieces that tend to be present within Sudan and South Sudan, I should say. Cool. I think we're good for questions. Cool. So I kind of wanted to flip on to the second half of this presentation. I thought, and this is kind of a theme that Lucia, Dylan, and I have discussed multiple times, kind of while we've been working with NGOs and kind of within our kind of own internal EBRI environment, is that there seems to be, and when I say lack of knowledge, maybe it's not exactly the right phraseology for it, there seems to be maybe a lack of understanding kind of how correspondent banking works generally, and more importantly, how correspondent banking interacts with sanctions compliance, and why that can often cause delays and kind of cause payments to be held, and kind of result in what may be described as some as an overall problematic experience for NGOs who are trying to make payments that either supported by general licenses, specific licenses, or anything like that into jurisdictions like Syria. That's changed slightly, but or any jurisdiction which is subject to some degree of sanctions or high risk flag. So I wanted to kind of, before we get into some of the more specifics, how it interacts with sanctions compliance, I wanted to just give an overall view of what correspondent banking is. And I appreciate to some people on this course maybe sucking eggs a little bit, and I apologize for kind of going back to basics, but I always feel like it could be quite helpful to start with this uber basic definition before we layer on top so kind of some of the more complex elements of correspondent banking and where that interacts with sanctions and kind of sanctions compliance. So the basic principle of correspondent banking, as as most people are probably aware, is banks providing services primarily in the form of payments to other jurisdictions of the countries in which they do not have a physical presence. So as a very basic example of step one, an individual in the UK wants to make a payment to one of his mates in France. His bank in the UK does not have a presence in France, so they have a partner bank or a correspondent bank, I think is often used the term, in France. I think the Paris bank here, just for the sake of ease of understanding, and that particular bank in Paris will help facilitate that payment locally because the UK bank does not have a presence there. So that, again, that's a very kind of basic step one, step two, step three illustration of how correspondent banking works. And I don't think there's any question on that, so I'll kind of quickly move on to the next point where I hope there will be questions, or at least some additional degree of knowledge. So what I want to do here is kind of build on that kind of correspondent banking model, and as I mentioned, kind of explain how that interacts with sanctions and kind of some of the underlying processes and requirements present. I mean, I've used banks as an example, but the same would apply to most payment institutions that NGOs may not necessarily be aware of on the surface. A lot of these processes tend to happen when I say behind closed doors, within the internal infrastructure of banks or and or payment institutions. So in this instance, we have a random UK-based charity. I'm describing a name to it here. Attempts to make a payment through the UK, a USD payment to the UK that ultimately ends up in Turkey. Now we haven't even gone beyond that in terms of cash into Syria. We're just going to go with a basic model. So hopefully you can see my mouse. I'm going to kind of follow the screen through and kind of talk you through steps that often typically happen within a banking infrastructure, just to illustrate some of the complexity about how this stuff works. So the charity makes their payment. Let's say for the purpose of this, it's supported by a general license. Let's just assume the general license is valid and all the remaining checks and balances in respect to the general license are in place, and then they've been conducted by the NGO. They present the payment to their bank, who's based in the UK, same place they are. They want to make the payment in USD because that's in line with their license provisions. When the payment is initiated by the charity or the NGO, it then goes into the SWIFT network and it follows then the internal process prescribed to the bank. So Bank A in this instance will almost 100%, or if not 1,000%, have some type of sanction screening filter. Now, what does that mean? Means that it is a tool which will flag payments that have some degree of sanctions nexus, either through list-based sanctions or country-based sanctions or multiple kind of formats of sanctions. It's a automated function that almost every institution will have in order to ensure they're complying with sanctions and not paying who they shouldn't be paying. Now, effectively, that will flag that will flag within the sanction screening filter is often the terminology used for that, which means the payment cannot be released from the UK branch until it has passed those relevant compliance checks. Now, in my experience, and others may have different systems, but there tends to be 3 levels to sanction screening, right? And those 3 levels of approvals are directly tied to the complexity of a payment. So payments will generally follow a level 1, which in some institutions is an AI or a model-based learning decision. It will then go to a human at level 2. Sorry, apologies, got that. We're going to go to a human at level 2 who'll review it, who will then send it to a experienced individual at a level 3, which is again the kind of the levels generally tend to be operational designations, and they are directly correlated with the level of complexity. So in this instance, the general license for a payment going to Syria is likely to end up on the very complex scale, given some of the considerations. If you get it wrong, if you approve the payment that wasn't under the general license terms, that could have pretty serious repercussions. So this payment is likely to go through 3 sets of approvals. That means 3 different teams. That means 3 different escalations. That means 3 different processes, payment reviews, etc., before it is ultimately approved. Right now, most SLAs for this tend to be quite quick, but you have around the world models. You have some institutions who are based in different parts of the country where they have different time zones. So you can have a lot of complexities there. So that can often take just a few days, at least, if not longer, for Bank A to internally clear that payment and make sure they're satisfied that the payment is in line with the general license. Let's assume they do. They clear that. All those steps take place. Bank A will then release it because it's a USD. Then let's say they have a US branch, so it will go to Bank A's US branch. Bank A's US branch will also have a sanction screening filter with the same purpose. It will likely be calibrated in a similar, or if not exactly the same way as the UK branch. So this same transaction, given it has a Syria nexus, is likely to flag in screening there as well. Now, it should be a simple process of reviewing the previous approvals, but banks are big, complex machines that work a certain way for a very specific reason. So it can often take time for those approvals to make their way to the relevant individuals, but it will likely need to be approved by a head of sanctions or someone senior within the sanctions organization, attributable to the US branch, because at that point, then you enter into US nexus. So it's important to ensure that the transaction really is in line with the general license. When the payment's in the UK, you have rejection options. The US, there may be, depending on the circumstances, maybe blocking obligations, and the obligations on US persons, including banks and individuals, are a bit more severe for US sanctions. They can be for UK persons, right? That's a general point, but hopefully the meaning translates pretty well. So there's another set of approvals that would need to be required, need to be reviewed. The relevant individual approving the payment would obviously have to review it, get his or her team to review it to make sure that they also agree it's in line. They could leverage some of the information from the previous reviews, but I know that if it was me, I'd likely want to conduct an independent review to make sure I'm comfortable, because then my name's against that particular payment if there was an issue that could be consequential towards me in that particular circumstance. So let's put it into proof. So I think we can already start to see where some of the degree of complexity comes into, and we're just talking about one institution here. In order to get to the bank in Turkey, the final beneficiary bank, it needs to go to the beneficiary bank's US correspondent. That's likely to be a different US institution to the one it just come from. That is likely to follow the same payment screening, sanction screening model, or at least a very, very similar one. Now, where it starts to become even more complex once it's left the US branch is that the beneficiary bank of the correspondent, the one on the bottom right you can see here, will also have 3 levels of sanction screening, but more importantly, they are not directly facing the client, right? Their client, sorry, I keep clicking the screen. Their client is the US branch of Bank A. So should they have any questions attributable to the payment? Should they have any requirements for documentation? Should they have any requirements for anything that would require, client interaction? They are 3 steps removed from the NGO. So they would then have to potentially issue an RFI to the US branch, who would then have to potentially issue the RFI to the UK branch, and hopefully the theme becomes quite clear there. Now the hope is it would be reviewed independently, and the relevant information would be present with the payment message. But obviously that's not always a guarantee, right? Things can get lost in translation. Different teams in different countries with different risk appetites reviewing payments, can often have differing views. I know I've done it multiple times before where I've had different views to other institutions, and they've had different views to me. So this is a sort of, maybe not completely normal, but it is not a completely uncommon typology or thing to happen. So these things do happen, right? So you're likely to see a significant degree of time for this beneficiary bank or the US correspondent of this beneficiary bank to conduct their own internal reviews to make sure they're comfortable releasing that payment. Let's assume they finally are. Then it will then go to the final beneficiary bank in Turkey. Now, the due diligence standards in a country like Turkey are not likely to be as extreme as somewhere like the US and the UK. So they may not have the same 3 levels of sanction screening. They may do. It would depend. I won't want to generalize on Turkish banks, but I think the point probably still stands. However, they still may have questions, right? And again, if you had an RFI that needs to be required, you can again follow the pattern quite quickly of where it has to go back to before that RFI is ultimately answered and the funds are credited to the final beneficiary who, for the purpose of this demonstration, the purpose of the example, are based in Turkey. So it's important to note that at any stage the funds can be delayed throughout this process. At any various level of sanction screening, they could be blocked. They may not be frozen, but they could be blocked pending an investigation. Swift RFIs for anyone who's used them are notoriously fiddly and not maybe the best system of issuing RFIs. So if you don't base the client directly, you have a challenge with character limitations, with things you can request. And often payment, and I've spoken to many NGOs who say my payment stuck with these guys, or payment stuck with those guys. And it can be a really, really complex matter to unpick. This is quite a few banks in the chain. It's not always this many. It will depend on the correspondent banking structure and the relationship of Bank A and the Turkish bank in this instance. But I've seen some with more, I've seen some with less. There are multiple different kind of variations of how this particular model may or may not work. This is a kind of somewhere kind of middle of the line in terms of complexity. But again, the purpose of this, and hope this will be a takeaway for NGOs, is that these are very complex machines to run, both sanction screening as in its own right, as well as what we call alert, or tend to call alert adjudication within the kind of the compliance law, which is the review of the actual sanctions alert which gets triggered, and how the review takes place, and then the multiple procedures and policies that dictate that review. And that can be very complex because the consequence of getting it wrong can be pretty severe, right? If a payment wasn't in line with the general license and you released it, that could have pretty severe repercussions for your institution. So it's vitally important that people conduct these checks and balances, and I've conducted many checks and balances in my time. But hopefully that gives some of the people on this call kind of a slightly better understanding of how that stuff works, and some of the complexities behind those various different levels and kind of the way that kind of whole process works. I will pause for a few questions. I've been talking for about 10 minutes now, so I'll pause for a few questions if there are any in respect to kind of correspondent banking, either more generally or in respect to sanctions alerts more specifically.
Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. But I had one, Hamza, based on also a conversation that we had recently. I think it's important here. It looks like such a complex process, right? There's so many layers of approval that need to happen. So my question would be, for NGOs, what are some of the proactive steps that they can take when they speak to their banking partner regarding their bank's dialogue with downstream banks in the correspondent chain? What questions can they ask to ensure that the transactions can be as smooth as possible?
Yeah, I think you hinted on it there. I think for me, my personal advice would be taking that proactive approach. So, whether it's a bank or a more traditional bank or a payment service provider or something in between, there's a lot of different institutions these days. It's very important for you, again, putting myself in the mind of the NGO, as a kind of consumer or a customer to some extent, is to ensure that your bank or whoever you're facilitating payments with is aware of the complexities of this, and you're speaking to the right people within that institution. So asking your payment institution, okay, who do you use for your correspondent banking? Who do you use for your US dollar correspondent? If I want to get US dollars from X to Y, do you know how that will work? Who are the best people to speak to? It's again, I'd be a strong advocate of taking that proactive approach, ensuring that banks have those open communication channels with their correspondent banks, because most of them do. When you have regular Swift messages, or emails can be a mechanism for it as well, depending on the nature of the institution. But it's super important for NGOs to kind of press, in my view anyway, to press that dialogue, right? To really hit home that, look, we want to get payments from X to Y as soon as possible. We appreciate there's going to be a degree of complexity, but what can we do to facilitate that? What documents do you need to satisfy yourself, whether that's a general license, specific license, or a myriad of invoices, or whatever. Again, the relevant document will depend on the payment, but it's ensuring that you have those appropriate documentations at present where you can supply them to your bank, and then going to your bank and asking them to proactively ensure that their downstream correspondent relationships are in a place where they could facilitate serious transactions. Because going back to our example, if again, this is a bit of a facetious one, but kind of bear with me. If Bank A's US branch has an appetite to process payments under a specific license, the beneficiary bank's US correspondent, the Turkish bank's correspondent, may not, right? Now, that's a bit of a black and white example and maybe unlikely to materialize in real life, but you hopefully get the point I'm trying to make here, right? Like, different banks are well in their right to have different degrees of risk appetite, and they often do. We will do some transactions others won't do, and kind of vice versa. That's a pretty normal kind of typology within both sanctions and kind of wider fin crime remits, right? Risk appetite is a real consideration. So it's understanding that those differences are, making sure that whoever you use to make these payments, whoever you intend to use, has an understanding of how that whole thing works, or they can speak to the relevant person within their organization who does. Tester payments are a great thing. I know they can be really frustrating for people, and I can be frustrated by tester payments too, but it can be a really good way sometimes to test this infrastructure out at a more practical level to see if, okay, does this payment actually work, or can we actually do this?
I've got a question, Hamza. It's kind of a two-pronged question, and you might be echoing yourself a little bit, but just for simplicity from a banking perspective, what are the most common red flags that you face when dealing with payments, delays or rejections when it comes to high-risk jurisdictions? But the second prong of it would be, what are your most frustrating shortfalls or reoccurring things that you see NGOs or companies do? So yeah, I suppose red flags and frustrations.
Yeah, I think, there are multiple red flags, and these can kind of materialize and present themselves in very different ways. I think on a personal level, if you have a strong relationship with an NGO and they intend to make a payment, let's use Syria as the example because it's probably the easiest one for this, that they can have that upfront conversation with their provider, right? That they intend to make this payment, rather than make the payment and kind of just hope for the best kind of thing. Again, I'm sort of oversimplifying it for effect here, but hope that kind of point comes across. If you have that, and this is kind of similar to the point that Lucia made, that kind of upfront dialogue with your institution, that this is the kind of payment activity you intend to do. And again, each bank or each institution will manage that relationship very different, and then that's their own kind of prerogative. And there are many pros and cons, different methods of managing that relationship. But in my view, ensuring that the relevant individuals are aware of what's happening so they can then do the corresponding checks, that's a huge one. Red flags would be, if you were to speak to an NGO, and this doesn't necessarily happen much in my experience, but does happen occasionally, where they don't necessarily, and this touches on my tips and tricks a little bit, but if they don't necessarily have a full understanding or full acceptance of the type of risk that they're asking the bank or the provider to make in respect to making a payment to Syria, Afghanistan, or wherever it might be, that can often be a red flag for me. I think that there isn't all, and maybe this is a sort of slightly, banking kind of or payment provider element of it, but these are very tricky payments to make, right? Even with the best of intentions. So if you don't have people on each side who understand the risks and the particular concerns and what not should go wrong, but could possibly go wrong, I think you have to be kind of open with those facts. That can potentially present a red flag as well. Documentation not being in order, Not understanding terms of licenses is a common one. People quoting the wrong general license because they Googled something that can be a kind of personal red flag / frustration. For me, when they haven't done the relevant due diligence on their side to ensure the payment actually is within the scope of the license. That's probably more applicable to general than specific, but I have seen it with both in the past as well. So hopefully that kind of answers kind of both points of those questions.
Hamza, there were two questions in the Q&A regarding correspondent banking and due diligence, and then I'm conscious there was one that was more in reference to that. So maybe we do those two on correspondent banking as it's applicable to this slide, and then we'll remember to go back to that one.
I will get back to your question, I promise.
Can you read the Q&A ones there?
I only have the one that Dylan sent me previously.
Oh, no, that's fine. I'll pop it in the chat. So the first one here on correspondent banking was, with respect to correspondent banking due diligence, how much emphasis would you place on understanding sanctioned adjacent countries and how banks in those countries manage sanctions risk? For example, if I was onboarding a UAE-based bank, how much focus would you place on their controls to prevent Iran flows through your payment rails?
It's a very good question, and I think it speaks to some of the heart of the individuals who do correspondent banking due diligence. I've done it before. It's a very complicated job for that reason. I think it's super important to understand geographical risk, right? Whether you're speaking about the UAE is a good example. So just for context, the UAE does not have any sanctions program against Iran. Transactions with Iran, relative, speaking at a very general level, are permissible locally within the UAE. Ebury has an institution in the UAE, so we're very cognizant of this type of risk. Most major banks providers have sort of UAE presence in some capacity. All the big ones I've worked for have. So it's a risk we're very conscious of. I think it's sort of very much depends. I mean, I think most banks who operate in these jurisdictions are conscious of this. So they are aware that from a kind of correspondent banking due diligence perspective, it's hard to say that this is a question that's going to be asked, right? So often they'll ask who their client base is, what controls do you have to ensure we are segregated from Iranian flows. Again, that's a very basic variation of that question, but it kind of speaks to the heart of what the concern will be. So banks will look to align risk appetites and say, look, we might want this flow, but we don't want that flow, right? And you need to demonstrate how you can keep us away from that flow. And I think when making payments, from our perspective, I think using, it's something which we're always cognizant of and we will always consider within the wider risk profile. Some countries present higher risk than others. UAE is a good example, but the UAE has a reasonably kind of mature banking system, maybe not quite as mature as the UK and the US, but from a Middle Eastern perspective is reasonably mature. If you're talking about Lebanon, maybe, okay, again, maybe not the most applicable example, but, we again know that banking structure has multiple, sort of issues with it. So banks that do there may be more problematic based on their kind of the risk scoring of the country, similar to the question on Syria someone asked kind of earlier before. As well as the bank and kind of how their local laws and what their local sanctions regimes may or may not implement. But it's a good question and it's a fair point.
And then the second one was, what kind of information would you recommend for NGOs to include in the payment for banks to get comfort?
Again, a good question, and one we've kind of on a more personal level grappled with quite a few times. I think at a very basic level, as well as informing the institutions, obviously, of the intentions and that type of stuff, if there is a reliance on either a general or a specific license, if it's a SWIFT message, which it most likely always will be, at this stage anyway, it's ensuring that the relevant references, especially the US one will have GL, ABC or whatever the relevant, as well as the specific license will have a number attached to it. Quoting that within the payment message, I think is almost a must. If you're not doing that, then I think you're likely to run into some troubles along the way, because that's an obvious point for people to be able to independently review that without having to RFI the payment message, because that information is present within the message. Again, as it stands now, we have a swift change from MT messages to MX messages, where there's likely to be more ability to put more information in there. So that's something to think about, sort of more payment infrastructure, sort of very long term. But yeah, that would be the kind of basic must for me. But obviously, you are restricted by character limits, by payment date that needs to be present in the message, which addresses names, which can't not be there. But yeah, if you're relying on general license or specific licenses, quoting those relevant reference numbers or numberings is vital to ensuring that other banks are aware that that's the regulatory authority or the legislative authority you're relying on to process payment to Syria or wherever it is.
Great. And then the question, I'm going to just post it again into the chat. The previous question, which was again on due diligence, but it was specifically regarding in the context of Gaza. It was in the context of humanitarian operations in high risk and sanctioned environments like Gaza. How can INGOs ensure they are effectively identifying and documenting indirect financial flows, particularly in cases where payments are made to private vendors, for example, utility or telecom providers? They may be operating under or alongside sanctioned local authorities. What level of due diligence and evidentiary threshold would satisfy regulators such as OFSI when the ultimate beneficiary or control of services is unclear?
This is a great question, and I'd love to spend a lot of time on it. So again, I know we're a bit short on time, but I'll try and spend as much time as the very detailed question kind of deserves. I think it can be very difficult, and I think without a specific situation, it can be hard to sort of independently determine exactly what documentation we need. Any type of independent documentation is always going to be useful, right? Things you can independently verify. But I also get that's not always possible, right? Like, telecoms, often you have NGOs who have workers who are doing very relevant aid work in these jurisdictions who just want to be paid their salary or just want to be paid their expenses. And that can be extremely challenging because sometimes the documentation around that, for food expenses, you can't necessarily provide invoices or relevant documentation. OFSI in the past have had a very, very high threshold for what they consider to be either relevant evidence or what they would consider to satisfy their particular regulatory requirements. And they won't obviously say, give me X or Y. That's not necessarily how it works. But from a bank to protect themselves or an institution to protect themselves, it's a bit of a cop-out answer, so I'll kind of sort of start and legislate it with that. But I think what I would start with saying is that the important part would be able to ensure that if there is ambiguity somewhere in that payment chain, whether it's there's we're paying this local provider who is potentially in the same building as a sanctioned entity or has a connection, is establishing that up front and ensuring that your bank or payment institution is comfortable with that from the start, right? And understanding that, look, I can't give you X or I can't give you Y. I can give you all this, but I can't give you that. And this is why we're comfortable as an institution. And it kind of goes back on the points I made before, the more holistic ones is, has this payment channel been independently verified? Has the board of the charity or the INGO verified this? Have they acknowledged the risks? A lot of times risk acceptance is a big word. I think risk appetite is often misunderstood. Like, you do have to accept some degree of risk. And I think every institution will have a different risk appetite, but they will still accept risk in some capacity. So it's be able to articulate really coherently, and it's not possible in a payment message, but it's very possible when you're speaking to your provider, of exactly where you as an institution see the sanctions risk. So through a telecom provider, or Syriatel previously was something which was a big problem. I know in the past it doesn't exist anymore, but that typology is still there with other similar organizations in Gaza. So it's be able to explain that and explain why the checks and balances are there to protect that, and why the payment should be made on the basis or what the evidence is. Again, I know I'm over time, but I'll keep going on if people will kind of hear me. I think with this stuff, often it is expensive to obtain independent legal advice, but it's a huge bonus for payment institutions if you have independent legal advice. Again, I also completely acknowledge that is not cheap, and it's very difficult to do and time consuming, and has a lot of problems. But if the goal is to get aid there, that can be a mechanism or a lever you could an NGO or a charity or any institution, quite frankly, can pull, and that can have a huge amount of bearing on whether a bank is comfortable doing something or not, or any institution really.
One thing I would just jump in there and say is, because I'm conscious we're over time and your time is very precious, but if there are specific examples like this one, right, about informal payments or payments like telecom related, something like that is a little more either regionally sensitive or sensitive to the work that you do and requires a bit more conversation, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to have a conversation around how we would go about looking at that, what kinds of information we would ask for, because I know that they might just be, they might be specific to the work you're doing. So we can always have take that offline and have conversations further. But yeah, Hamza, if you want to finish off with our tips and tricks.
I'll absolutely try and run these again. I appreciate everyone's time is precious, and I tend to babble on. So thank you for being patient with me. I won't touch on these in too much detail. I think I've kind of hinted on these throughout the course of the last hour or so. But again, a lot of this stuff, sounds self-explanatory, but I know in my experience, both from NGOs and kind of more traditional corporates, don't always have these type of things present. So I think it's really being clear that, you know, you're relying on licenses, you're relying on policies. Where is the due diligence behind that? You know, if you have, whether it's from a KYC perspective, from an onboarding perspective, everyone complains about onboarding, which is obviously completely correct. You know, I've been onboarding, it's painful from all sides, but ensuring accurate KYC, ensuring that, you know, your ID and V verification, all this very, very basic stuff, including those being present and making those easily accessible, is such a win for everyone. I'm sure other people who've been involved in onboarding would attest that as well, rather than kind of having to pull and prod for every single document. Having a comprehensive kind of onboarding dossier, I think I've seen before, is extremely useful. I mentioned flow of funds, I mentioned ownership, these type of things, be able to accurately articulate how those things work to make it as easy as possible for everyone to get that kind of thing done. And just the final slide, I think there, you know, I know screening is again similar to what I mentioned about legal advice. It's obviously an expensive thing. You know, eBay spend a lot of money on it. A lot of other companies spend a lot of money on screening solutions, on sanction screening solutions. So I appreciate it's not necessarily something that everyone could either afford or is accessible to everyone. But, you know, what I would say, and this is a very obvious thing to say, OFSI, OFAC, the EU, all these sanctions programs are visible online, including the list-based sanctions are very easily visible. So screening those, reviewing those, doing all that type of stuff in advance of submitting a payment is massively, massively helpful, and something which I would highly recommend. You know, providers are great. There's brilliant providers out there all over the place. But if that's not within your remit to be able to afford, definitely looking at the publicly available services is a minimum for me. Being cognizant of high-risk channels, we mentioned that before. Bank dialogue, again, that is something which bank, or I should say payment institution dialogue there, is hugely beneficial. Liaison person, you know, ensuring that, you know, if there's a kind of compliance concern, talking to compliance always makes things easier. You know, no offense to sales and kind of more frontline colleagues within this institution, they're absolutely brilliant. But sometimes getting on compliance can sometimes be a very good way to hash out and kind of go through any you know, issues or differences there may be in opinion. And I mentioned staff training. I think I touched on that previously before. Again, I appreciate there's not something which everyone can do. It's very hard to do. Find the right speakers and the right individuals who can do that is again very challenging. But if you're trying to demonstrate to a bank or provider in some institution that you take your sanctions and kind of overall financial crime compliance very seriously, regular training, whether that's annually or whatever the relevant prescribed period is hugely beneficial, and it can definitely ensure that people within the NGO organization are aware of the relevant levels of risk, and they know how to deal with those internally before it kind of even gets out. Cool. I will stop there. If there are any questions, I can take those. I know that people maybe want to go and do whatever they need to do with that. So I probably will leave it there. But no, thank you so much for your time. That was really great. I really enjoyed talking to you guys, enjoyed listening. And yeah, you know, my details are available on LinkedIn. If anyone has either any feedback or any more general thing, please do let me know. And I'm happy to kind of have further discussions if needed.
Thanks, Hamza.
Thank you so much, Hamza. And yeah, as we mentioned, you know, if there's anything that is, you know, particularly sensitive that you'd like to discuss offline, any compliance concerns that you're dealing with at the moment, or tricky corridors, you know, we're always happy to lend our expertise. And Hamza's always been so great at jumping on calls with our clients. So I'm sure we could convince him as well. So please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you all
see you on the next one.
Yeah, see you at the next one. Exactly.
See you guys.
Hey guys.
Cheers.
Take care.